Good day. Big news in Ukraine over the last 24 hours is of many more Russian missile and drone attacks across Ukraine. Russian cruise missiles launched from strategic bombers, Russian drones operating across Ukraine, more and more attacks taking place in various parts of Ukraine. There are conflicting reports about whether Kiev itself was attacked over the last 24 hours. My sense is that the main, or at least the most heavily attacked place in Ukraine was the town of Dnipro on the Dnieper River. Dnipro being to a great extent a logistical center created by Ukraine in preparation both for this offensive, which it is supposed to launch in the south of Ukraine, but also perhaps a logistical center for the resupply of Ukrainian troops who are still trying to hold the Russians back in Donbass. Anyway, it's not entirely easy to get clear information about the scale or effect of these attacks. The Russian authorities routinely publish a rundown of what the attacks, of what places that they've attacked, but it doesn't offer a great many details, and one suspects that the Russians know a great deal more than they're even saying. One example, a few weeks ago, about 2 weeks ago, there was a big Russian missile strike on a massive Ukrainian ammunition depot in the town of Khmelnytsky. There was a colossal explosion the size of a mushroom cloud. The Russians simply said that an ammunition dump had been attacked in Khmelnytsky and said little else, not confirming or denying some of the reports, for example, that depleted uranium shells had been struck in this particular attack. So, big Russian missile and drone attacks across Ukraine, not a huge amount of information about what exactly the Russians are striking, are hitting, but certainly the tempo of the air campaign, the air and missile campaign that the Russians are conducting continues unabated. And incidentally, there's also reports that the Russian Air Force now routinely drops 500 kilo glide bombs on various parts of Ukraine every day. That doesn't sound like an awful lot, but these are big bombs, and the explosive charge in any one of these bombs is significantly greater than that which could be found in most of the missiles, at least, that the Russians are launching. So the cumulative effect of 20 bombs a day is substantial if it is continued over a long period. I'm going to say that earlier, about a week ago, there was a report that only around 5% of the Russian Air Force, tactical Air Force, is engaged in operations in Ukraine at any one time. And this is supposedly information provided to Ukraine by the British Ministry of Defence. There's hundreds of fighter bombers held in reserve back in Russia. The Sukhoi Bureau the factories at Khabarovsk that build these Sukhoi planes, and the United Aircraft Corporation, which is the umbrella corporation for the Russian aerospace industry, has just announced that a further batch of Sukhoi 34s have been delivered to the Russian Air Force. We don't know how big a batch is, how many aircraft are involved. The Russians never give us this information. But anyway, one way or the other, the Russians are engaged in some levels of bombing in Ukraine, but it does seem that the bulk of their tactical aviation is being held back in reserve. And my suspicion is that it's waiting either for Ukraine to launch its famous offensive, or in the alternative, waiting to support whatever offensive the Russians themselves launch. And we've been hearing lots of reports about Russia upgrading more and more of its 500 and 1500 kilo bombs with wings and guidance systems that convert them quickly and easily into precision guided glide bombs. We also hear that the Russians have developed a similar kit for their 250 kilo bombs, which are also being converted in large numbers, and these two apparently will be deployed on their on their fighter bombers, and probably, as I said, a larger air offensive at some point involving all these aircraft will take place. Now, I would add, in addition, that there are some reports that suggest that the Russian missile and drone strikes on Dnipro were effectively unopposed, that Ukrainian air defense assets, such as they are now almost entirely concentrated in protecting Kiev, and that this has left the Russians in a position where they're much more free to launch strikes elsewhere in Ukraine. The information from the Russian Defense Ministry that they destroyed Ukraine's largest remaining surface ship and amphibious warfare ship in Odessa, for example, seems to be confirmed. There's been photographs of this, of what looks like remains of this ship, which has clearly been sunk, and apparently there's complaints from people in Odessa that there's a large oil slick which appears to be on the sea, which appears to be associated with the sinking of this vessel. And Odessa, until fairly recently, was one of the most heavily defended cities in terms of Ukrainian air defense, largely because the Odessa is a key port for Ukraine. It's where its grain exports are sent from. It's also a major transit point for American and Western weapon systems moving into Ukraine as they get dispersed across the country. Now, on that point, Scott Ritter, former US Marine Major, former US intelligence officer, member of the Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, guest at various times on many, many channels, including on the Duran, by the way, and somebody I know well and have great respect for, is discussed the latest launches by the Russians of various reconnaissance satellites, including a reconnaissance satellite which apparently has some kind of radar system. Somebody suggested that this is something called a synthetic aperture radar. I'm not at all sure what that is. If anybody wishes to enlighten me, they are very welcome. And I'm not entirely sure whether this is the sort of radar that this satellite has. But anyway, apparently it can detect and map location objects that are about a meter in scale. And Scott Ritter makes the point that this satellite, together with an additional satellite array which Russia is creating over Ukraine, is now giving the Russians basically complete reconnaissance, complete information about everything that's happening in Ukraine, about all the movements of troops and equipment that's taking place. Obviously, this isn't just the satellites that are doing this. It's also drones, intercepted communications. As I said, the RUSI Forum, the RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, has confirmed that the Russians have decrypted some levels of Ukrainian military communications. And of course, the Russians will have lots of other means of reconnaissance and surveillance far greater than I know about and any of us can know about. And by the way, this essentially is similar to the information previously provided. Scott Ritter's comments are essentially similar to the kind of information that Simplicius the Thinker has previously provided. One gets the sense that once more the Russians, when they went to war in February 2022, they hadn't yet prepared fully for this war in that way. They hadn't yet got all their satellites and all their surveillance equipment operating. They were at that stage still looking for a political settlement. That, as I've said many times now, was partly what the whole advance on Kiev was all about. And there were negotiations, and a political settlement was almost achieved. And on the 29th of March, an outline proposal was from Ukraine was agreed and apparently even initialed by the Russians, who shortly after made their own counter-proposal, and it looked as if the initial Russian plan to force Ukraine into negotiations was about to pay off, until, of course, the Western powers, principally the United States and Britain, with the then British Prime Minister Boris Johnson playing the leading role, came in and brought it all to a stop. Anyway, at that time, the Russians weren't apparently thinking about an all-out war. They didn't have all their satellites operating. They hadn't yet sorted out and launched all their satellites. They hadn't mobilized the large forces that they needed. They hadn't brought to bear the entirety of their military power. Increasingly, it seems, they are doing so. And this array of satellites that Scott Ritter is talking about is just one further example of this, as is the steady concentration and build-up of Russian aviation that I was talking about previously. And in the meantime, even as all of this is going on, we're getting further reports of significant Russian advances. And the focus at the moment appears to be Marinka. This is this town southwest of Donetsk city, heavily fortified by Ukraine, used by Ukraine as one of its key bases to try to press its siege of Donetsk city in the long years since the 2014 war. The Russians made a sustained attempt to capture Marinka in the autumn, and in October they actually, or rather the authorities in the Donetsk region, actually claimed that Marinka had indeed been captured. Except that it turned out that this was not true. It turned out that the Ukrainians were dug into the western part of Marinka, and the whole fight for Marinka degenerated into a stalemate. Every couple of weeks, Denis Bushilin, the acting head of the Donetsk People's Republic, would be interviewed on Russian television about the situation in Marinka. He would repeatedly say that the situation there is improving from a Russian point of view, but that improvement never seemed to result in the outright capture of the town. And as I've discussed in recent videos, I've come to the view that this was probably intentional on the Russian side. It seems that Ukraine, in trying to hold on to this western fringe of Marinka that was still under its control was experiencing heavy losses. It was having to rotate troops continuously to try to cling on to this area under heavy Russian fire. And I suspect that in Marinka, the Russians basically pulled off a mini Bakhmut. In other words, they used the fighting in Marinka again to draw Ukrainian forces and to inflict attrition upon them. But, as I've also discussed in recent programs, it seems that now a decision has been made to finally resolve this problem of Marinka once and for all. And it does seem as if things are now accelerating. Yesterday, there were more reports that still more areas of Marinka have been captured, and the leading role in the fighting in Marinka has been played by the Chechen forces, led by their commander, Avdeyevka. And again, I will repeat the comment that I made in previous videos. I'm not going to give a timeline here. I'm not in any position to, but I suspect that at some point over the next couple of days, weeks maybe, we'll be hearing that the whole of Marinka has finally and conclusively passed under Russian control. There's also reports that there are further advances by Russian troops in the Avdeyevka area. Avdeyevka is a much bigger place than Marinka. Before the war, it had a population of around 30 to 35,000. It too is located close to Donetsk city. It's north of Marinka, and it was the main Ukrainian military position near to Donetsk city. And Ukrainian artillery routinely continues by the way to shell Donetsk city from Avdeyevka. Well, over the last few weeks, really starting in March, the Russian forces have been steadily, incrementally pressing on Avdeyevka. They've been strongly backed by the Russian Air Force. This is where a lot of these 20-kilo bombs that I was talking about fall. They seem to have succeeded in breaking quite a lot of Ukraine's defences in the area. I think it was in March that they captured the important village of Krasnogorovka, which had become a major fortified position of Ukraine, protecting Avdeyevka from advances by the Russian army from the north. And over the last few days, there's been more reports that the Russians have been pressing forward faster in the Avdeyevka area. They're now absolutely on the outskirts of Avdeyevka, and again, it looks as if Chechen forces are involved. Now, I should stress again, there's much less information about either of these battles, about Marinka or Avdeyevka, than we've ever had about the fighting in Bakhmut. That makes it extremely difficult to reconstruct events in either of these two battle areas. In fact, we were perhaps privileged, if I can put it like this, in terms of Bakhmut and the fighting there. We got a very clear view of what was going on a day-to-day basis because, well, Yevgeny Prigozhin was providing us with detailed updates all of the time. Wagner, the force, the Russian spearhead force that was aiming to capture Bakhmut, has an active Telegram channel which was also providing an abundance of information. There was a high concentration of Russian military journalists also in Bakhmut, and the result is that we were kept very fully informed about what was going on in that particular battle. The same, I'm afraid, is not true to anything like the same degree about the fighting in Marinka and Avdeyevka. But as I said, I do get the sense that in both places there's been an acceleration of Russian advances, and doubtless that will continue over the next couple of days and weeks. Anyway, that's what I want to say about fighting in those places. Yesterday, I talked a great deal about the fighting near Kupiansk, the fact that the Russian forces appear to be making headway in the Kupiansk area. There's been some information about this now from Boris Rozhin. Boris Rozhin is one of these people who is one of these Russian military commentators who discusses the war at great length. And as I said, he writes under the pen name of Colonel Kassad. He's a very reliable reporter of events and commentator about events. Though, of course, he does bring to them, to his reporting and his commentary, his own perspective, which is staunch opposition to Ukraine, basically a strong support for the Russian war effort, and all of these opinions, all of this commentary is informed by his open and entirely unabashed communist views. Anyway, he has this to say about the fighting near Kupiansk, and he says that reports about the liberation of the Novomlinsk village by Russian troops, this is near Kupiansk, there is no photo, video verification of these statements at the moment. The main battles to the northwest of Kupiansk are taking place in the area of Dvorochnaya and Sinkovka. The enemy, that's to say, the Ukrainian forces, have failed to return the positions lost by the armed forces of Ukraine near Masyutovka. Masyutovka, as I understand it, is located west of the Oskol River. So he then goes on to say that information about the location of our troops, that's to say the Russian troops, 1.5 kilometers from the outskirts of Kupiansk, is also ahead of events. A real advance to the northwest outskirts of Kupiansk will be possible with the liberation of Sinkovka and Petropavlovka, as well as the forest area west of Sinkovka. And he's provided a rather interesting map which shows all of these places and gives a fairly interesting idea of where the fighting is and shows the front line. There's a blue line which appears to show where the front line currently is. And I should say straight away that the front line does indeed appear to be, judging from this map, very close indeed to Kupiansk. So I'm not going to repeat what I said in yesterday's program about the importance of Kupiansk, both its strategic significance and its psychological and political significance too, the effect it will have on Ukraine if Kupiansk is recaptured by the Russians after Ukraine itself recaptured it from the Russians during the fighting last autumn. So that's what Boris Rozhin has to say about the fighting in Kupiansk. It's still clearly ongoing. The Russians are still pressing here, and there does seem to be a concerted push towards Kupiansk. And as I said, the front line does indeed appear to be getting very close to Kupiansk. Indeed, that the Ukrainians are putting up a fierce resistance. Now, Boris Rozhin has something else to say about some other events that are also taking place in other areas. He says, for example, that Ukraine did make a successful advance in the Zaporozhye area, and he speaks about this principally as a kind of reconnaissance in force, but anyway, it does appear to be that the Ukrainians made some kind of an advance in the Zaporozhye area. This is the area where many people expect Ukraine to conduct its offensive. I will come back to that shortly. And he has some rather interesting things to say about the situation in Bakhmut, Artyomivsk, as perhaps we should call it. Now, yesterday, the Deputy Defense Minister of Ukraine issued a statement. She said that the situation in Bakhmut, she continued to call it, remains complex, tense, but she said that Ukraine continues to control the southwest outskirts of Bakhmut, implying that Bakhmut, parts of Bakhmut, are still under Ukrainian control. Now, this repeats the pattern that Ukraine has followed over many of the places that it has lost control of, especially in the last few weeks. It took Ukraine roughly 2 weeks to admit, for example, that the town of Solidar, north of Bakhmut, had been fully captured by the Russians. And in the case of Bakhmut, the Ukrainians have never admitted that the Russians control Bakhmut in its entirety, but here we have the Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister going a step further than that, implying that Ukraine is still in control, is actually in physical control of parts of the southwestern outskirts of Bakhmut. Well, Colonel Kassad, or Boris Rozhin, perhaps as I should more properly call him, has provided an explanation for this frankly somewhat bizarre claim. He said that Ukraine doesn't control any part of Artyomivsk, the former Bakhmut, but there are fields, open fields to the southwest, and from time to time small groups of Ukrainian infantry do enter these fields, which are within the metropolitan area of Bakhmut, Artyomivsk, before they quickly leave. And he said that once the rotation is completed, once the Wagner forces have been fully replaced by the Russian regular army and the Chechen force that is also being located in Bakhmut, then the Russians will have the job of finally tidying up this mess, of capturing Khromovo and Ivanivska, which he of course calls Krasnoye, and in other words, securing fully this entire area under the control of the Russians. It is indeed the case that the Russians have made attacks towards Ivanivska, and he again provides a map. He shows the area of open fields where from time to time Ukrainian troops enter, and he shows how close it is, in fact, to Ivanivska, and Krasnoye, as he calls it. And he also shows, by the way, how close the Russian troops now are to Ivanivska. Now, I've seen maps that existed from previously, which was circulating at the time of Ukraine's counterattack in the Bakhmut area back in May. And as far as I can see, the Russians have successfully pushed the Ukrainians back from many of the places which they captured over the course of that counterattack, and they're once again very close indeed to Ivanivska. Anyway, that's my reading of Boris Rozhin's explanations of things. Now, notice one important fact. The Chechens are now involved in 3 locations. They're fighting in Marinka. They're the spearhead of the Russian attacking force in Marinka. They're attacking in Avdeyevka, and they're also attacking, or at least they're also being redeployed to Bakhmut. Now, Alaudinov has said that his force, his brigade, consists of 3 regiments, and we see how these regiments are being deployed. One regiment, the veteran regiment, the one that's been in the battle area the longest, is being deployed to Marinka. Another regiment is being deployed to the Avdeyevka area, and the third is taking positions in Bakhmut. Now this is, to be clear, these are smaller forces than the Wagner organization forces that fought and captured Bakhmut. A regiment, we're talking about perhaps 2,000-3,000 men, I'm guessing now. I'm not absolutely sure. But the point is that these regiments do not work alone. As Alaudinov has been at pains to say, they are heavily supported by troops of the Russian regular army with whom they work as a team. Now, this return of the Chechens to the battlefronts has provoked some kind of a, to be frank, rather jealous reaction from some members of the Wagner organization. I suspect put up to do it to some extent by Prigozhin. And there's been some rather nasty exchanges between the Wagner forces and the Chechens. I'm not going to waste time detailing what's been said. Suffice to say, it's the Wagner forces who seem to be, the Wagner people who seem to be leading this, and the Chechens have responded in a rather more dignified and measured way, but they've made their own annoyance with the Wagner forces clear. And I gather that there's been some attempt by someone, presumably someone from the Russian military, to mediate, and the Wagner forces have backed off, and they've issued a statement which rather grudgingly appears to pull back a little on some of the things that they've been saying about the Chechens. Now, again, I can't help but think that the hand of Prigozhin is behind all of this. Until a few weeks ago, Kadyrov and the Chechens were his political allies in the fight in his in Ukraine, and both his comrades in fighting the Ukrainians, and also from time to time they worked alongside him in supporting some of his criticisms of the Russian Defense Ministry and some of the officials in the Russian Defense Ministry. Anyway, it seems that that friendship has become increasingly strained, something which, by the way, I find entirely unsurprising. And, well, here we see the evidence of it. Now, I come back to the point which I have made before in my previous video. There are some people who believe that Prigozhin at some point is going to mount some kind of big challenge against Putin. The actual reality is that he neither controls the Wagner organization, he doesn't decide where and how it's deployed and what it does, so he neither controls the Wagner organization, nor does he have a critical mass of support. On the contrary, he is becoming more isolated. His attacks on the leadership of the Russian Ministry of Defense, which may have included observations which were grounded in fact, were so extreme and so far off any factual or logical limit that they have steadily lost in support, to the point where it seems that the Chechen leaders are now washing their hands of him. And we see this in this somewhat prickly exchange, which I suspect, as I said, that he has instigated with some of the Chechen between the Chechens and some of the Wagner commanders. Again, I think people are overstating Prigozhin's importance in this conflict, and they're certainly exaggerating his political role. I think that before long, one way or the other, we will see him shunted to one side, and when Wagner is indeed fully reconstituted as a rather more, shall we say, conventional force, his role in it will decline. Anyway, having said that, I've had a very interesting discussion, explanation from my source, who's close to the Wagner organization, about the Battle of Bakhmut. And this person points out that this idea of Bakhmut having been of little strategic significance is completely wrong. His sources in the Wagner organization say that not only was Bakhmut part of the at the center of this hub of communications, transportation hub, which linked together the Ukrainian forces in Donbass, but it for a long time served the function as a primary headquarters or command post for the Ukrainian military defending Donbass. In other words, it's some kind of forward headquarters. And by the way, I can remember that myself. I remember at the time of the fighting in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk that the Ukrainian headquarters that seemed to be in overall, which was supervising overall Ukrainian defense of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, was actually at that time located in Bakhmut. And I remember that at the time of the Severodonetsk-Lysychansk battles, no less a person than President Zelensky of Ukraine actually came and visited the that particular headquarters and consulted with the Ukrainian commanders there. So he's absolutely right when he says, this source is absolutely right when he says that it was for a time a location of important headquarters of the Ukrainian army group in Donbass. But he says that Ukraine also had certain plans for Bakhmut. It was supposed to be a place where HIMARS missile systems were going to be forward-based in support of possible Ukrainian offensive action in Donbass. And Ukraine was also looking to establish sophisticated air defenses in Bakhmut as well, which would have turned Bakhmut into some sort of a forward fortress for Ukraine, perhaps in connection with some sort of possible offensive in the Donbass area. And what happened was that the Russian attack on Bakhmut preempted all of these plans. It means that HIMARS can't be located there. It means these air defense systems couldn't be established there. And of course, Ukraine lost its headquarters there. But this was why Ukraine defended Bakhmut so intensely. It was important to them strategically, and perhaps because of the role it played in their future plans, and they weren't prepared to give it up lightly. And in fact, in the end, they made the mistake of over-investing in its defense. Anyway, that's what this particular source has told me. And as I said, he's proved reliable and accurate about many other things that concern the Wagner organization up to this point. So anyway, that's, it seems to me, where we are on the battlefields. Major Russian missile and bomb strikes all over Ukraine. The Russians continue their air and missile offensive, and in addition, the Russians are pushing hard on Marinka and probably Avdeyevka as well, and they are now encroaching on, coming very close to Kupiansk as well. And as I said, the map I've seen, which Boris Ruzhin has provided, shows quite how close the Russians now are to Kupiansk. So that's the state of the war, or rather the battle, not perhaps so much the war. Now, I've discussed previously how the offensive that Ukraine is supposed to launch, the Zaporozhye offensive, as it's sometimes called, the spring offensive, as it was for a very long time called, appears to be continuously postponed. It's been postponed for various reasons, weather reasons, training, need to organize, prepare various things. It's always about to happen, and it never exactly happens. And today, in the London Times, we have a long report, and it suggests that this offensive is going to be postponed again. And the commentary, the title is, "We still don't have enough weapons for counteroffensive against Russia," Ukraine says. "We need more firepower, and the EU isn't doing enough on sanctions," says key Zelensky advisor. And then there's a long discussion about a interview with one of President Zelensky's aides, Dr. Igor Zhovka, deputy head of Zelensky's office and his chief foreign affairs advisor. And he said that the military needed more reinforcements to begin the long-awaited operation. And then the Times, the Sunday Times, he told the Sunday Times, "I'm not a military man." Well, that's said by someone else, not me this time. "I'm not a military man. I'm working on the diplomatic front, and my task is more weapons, more support, more ammunition. But if you want to start a successful counteroffensive, you need everything at your disposal, including artillery, armored vehicles, and tanks. So probably we don't have enough." And then there's lots of criticism about sanctions. He criticizes the EU for the fact that the sanctions have proved largely ineffectual. We'll come to that shortly. And anyway, the point is, the Times goes on to say that Zhovka's admission reflects a reality that has been extensively discussed in Kiev and Western capitals. Ukraine needs all the firepower it can muster to have a chance of driving the Russians off its land. The shortfall in weapons was why Zelensky has been on the move so much, Zhovka said. From May 3rd to June 2nd, you can calculate the number of countries he visited. It's huge, which is absolutely true. More weapons is the number one topic in each and every conversation. Every visit my president makes is about military help, further delivery of weapons. Every country knows what kinds of weapons we need from them to protect our country, stop the rockets. And then he talks about the state of Ukraine's air defense system. He says that Ukraine's air defense has become more sophisticated, but the pressure is affecting people. If you can't sleep for 7 days, day by day, you feel tired and have low morale. And then he goes on to say the assaults are also depleting Ukraine's air defenses, notably its stock of Patriots, the US air defense system of surface-to-air missiles. Obviously, we don't have enough. Ukraine is huge, and they're hitting each and every corner. There is not a single safe place left. Even the far west is being targeted. So here you have an admission from a very senior Ukrainian official that Ukraine's air defense system has essentially broken down. There's nowhere near enough missiles now to cover the whole of Ukraine, that in fact Russian missiles are increasingly getting through. Even the Ukrainians are now admitting this. And he talks about lowered morale, especially presumably in Kiev, as people can't sleep under the constant pressure of these Russian missile and drone strikes that go on day after day, night after night, unabated. And of course, in saying all of this, he echoes the words of his chief, President Zelensky. And President Zelensky has indeed been demanding weapons. He wants fighter jets, F-16s. He wants them in staggering quantities. He originally asked, apparently, for 24. That grew to 48. I believe the number now stands at 140. I might be wrong about that. But you get a sense of the voracious demand Ukraine makes for more and more aircraft, more and more weapons. And the latest demand for Patriot missile systems amounts to 50 batteries. 50 batteries, 8 launchers per battery. You can work it out for yourself. That would be, some people have worked out, $50 billion worth of kit to be supplied by the United States, presumably. Except, of course, doing that would strip the United States of all its Patriot missile batteries, which we know are needed by the United States because they are a centerpiece for countering China in the Pacific region. So, huge build-up of Patriot missiles is what Zelensky says Ukraine needs. Huge build-up of fighter jets, more than can possibly be provided by the Western powers. And you see increasingly the anger and resentments of officials in the West. You see people like Ben Wallace and Jens Stoltenberg grudgingly saying we've run out, our arsenals are depleted. You see the rather stiff comments repeatedly coming from the White House and the US government that in fact and in reality Ukraine has been provided with all the weapons it needs for its offensive, that these demands for weapons, I'm pretty sure the Americans have concluded that these demands for weapons, what they really are excuses by Ukraine to delay launching this offensive, which Ukraine basically doesn't want to launch because it knows in advance that it is most likely to fail. So we could see the push from one end to the other. The Ukrainians say we can't start this offensive because we don't have enough weapons. The West now increasingly saying we don't have any more weapons to give you. You must start this offensive now. If you delay much longer, the Russians will simply get stronger and political support for you in the West will flag. And that the fact that there is this tension and acrimony perhaps explains this very strange summit meeting that has just taken place in Chisinau in Moldova. All the European leaders were there, including Zelensky, President Vučić of Serbia, Prime Minister Orban of Hungary, all the Western leaders, all the West European leaders were there. And they met, and so far as one can see, no actual conclusions or announcements or declarations have come forth. There have been some really rather odd incidents. There's pictures of Zelensky trying to speak to President Vučić of Serbia, President Vučić, not particularly wanting to talk to Zelensky. It's a rather bizarre episode, and Zelensky having to walk off in the end in what looks like a huff. It is a little bit like the disastrous meeting between Zelensky and Prime Minister Modi of India in Hiroshima at the G7 summit. But anyway, there's been incidents like that. There's also pictures of Zelensky in some kind of heated debate with one of his advisors. I think it was Podolyak. I'm afraid I can't recognize the pictures very well with my eyes. But anyway, he does seem to have been in a rather argumentative mood, even with some of his own officials. And as I said, the fundamental thing to take away from all of this is that no real progress of any kind appears to have been made at this meeting in Moldova. In fact, it's not entirely clear what the purpose of this meeting in Moldova actually was, except possibly to provide another opportunity for Zelensky to leave Kiev. I'm half joking, this meeting would have been prepared long in advance, but also obviously to provide the Western powers with an opportunity to give support to Moldova's president, Maria Sandu, who is herself coming under increasing pressure from people within Moldova because of the declining living standards in that country and the fears that the country could be sucked into the war in Ukraine. So we can see the tensions that are rising around this offensive. And as I said, these words reported to the Times by Dr. Zhovka, and also, by the way, echoed in this very, very downbeat interview that Zelensky himself recently gave to the Wall Street Journal. All of this strongly suggests that, for the moment at least, Ukraine has no plan to carry out this offensive immediately. It's constantly looking for reasons to postpone it. And the result is this standoff between Ukraine and its Western allies. Well, there is an article which I should say I learned about from the Mood of Alabama, from Bernhardt at the Mood of Alabama, but it's in one of these American magazines, War on the Rocks, which is very much one that I suspect is mainly read by people in the military and security community of the United States. War on the Rocks, by the way, comes across to me as being one of the more neocon-minded of these publications. Anyway, it has a long piece by two people, Eric Kramer and Paul Schneider, obviously ex-US military. I get the sense that they are part of one of these multiplicity of entities that exist in the United States that provide what you might call security services. Anyway, whoever they are, it talks about what the Ukrainian armed forces need to do to win. And it describes a chaotic situation within the bulk of the Ukrainian army. It speaks of lack of mission command, effective training, and combined arms operations, ad hoc logistics and maintenance, and improper use of special operations forces. And it says that the Ukrainian military has become, it is extremely rigid and centralized in its decision making. It reproduces, by the way, the old myth that the Ukrainian military continues to be imbued with a Soviet mentality, which apparently discourages low-level initiative and insists and harps on centralized control. I have to say, I think that is extremely unlikely, by the way, in itself. It's always convenient to blame the Soviet Union for all of these kind of problems. The real reason, I think, why commanders, low-level commanders in the Ukrainian military are increasingly lacking in initiative is because the best of them by now will already have been killed. The reports speak of the war having already inflicted enormous damage on junior officers and, above all, the essential, the vitally important non-commissioned officer cadre. That is the core of any military. Anyway, it talks about how the situation, as I said, is poor. It says that a large-scale battalion-level training is orchestrated and choreographed. During several exercises, we witnessed company commanders overseeing the exercise from afar and only occasionally interjecting. They were acting more as observers than direct participants. That's completely different, by the way, from Russian and indeed Soviet practice, but I'm not going to get diverted into all of this. And it says that younger officers are more open to Western military-style leadership, whilst older officers have clung to Soviet doctrine. We have yet to see any true combined arms training involving infantry, artillery, and armour working together. Synchronizing all of these different elements to achieve maximum military effect, avoid fratricide, and confuse the enemy takes repeated training at all levels of command, which allows leaders to make mistakes and work through processes. And in fact, this isn't apparently what happens in Ukraine. And it also discusses the nature of training that has been provided to Ukraine by NATO. It says training is disjointed and haphazard, and the quality of instruction varies. NATO is training selected units and soldiers outside of Ukraine. Whilst this training can be effective and necessary for certain specialty skills, such as tank crews and HIMARS teams, it takes units and soldiers away from the front line for weeks, if not months at a time. Commanders cannot afford to lose units and soldiers for extended periods. According to our field research, there is evidence of this immediate need because most of the units we train go to the front the day after we finish a training session. And we also believe that the training efforts outside of Ukraine are not consistent and do not use common programs of instruction. And by the way, Simplicius the thinker and Larry Johnson have made the same point, that each NATO country that has undertaken to train Ukrainian soldiers is training them to follow its own methods of combat, with the result that the Ukrainian army is becoming increasingly diverse, or rather, I should say, fragmented, with different units trained according to different criteria and in different styles, and perhaps not able to achieve the necessary synergies that a force needs to achieve on the battlefield. They said Foreign training efforts adhere to the host country's doctrine, whilst they do attempt to incorporate the realities in Ukraine. Many of them do not fully adapt their training regimes to the way the Ukrainians fight, especially with the Ukrainian doctrinal and legal restraints on our operations. And they also make other complaints. By the way, as I said, Simplikis the thinker, Larry Johnson have already, as I said, discussed all of this. And they say that the lack of combining synchronized operations results in greater losses of life and equipment as well as failed operations. Tanks are used more as mobile artillery and not in combined operations with infantry, where the armour goes into action just as ahead of the infantry. We have seen firsthand the shot-out barrels of tanks and artillery from constantly being fired at maximum range or overused without maintenance or replacement. The armour-infantry relationship is supposed to be symbiotic, but it is not. The result is that infantry will conduct frontal assaults or operate in urban areas without the protection and firepower of tanks. Also, the artillery fires are not synchronized with maneuver. Most units do not talk directly to supporting artillery, so there is a delay in call for fire missions. We have been told that units will use runners to send fire missions to artillery batteries because of issues with communications. In fact, as I said, the Royal United Services Institute tells us that the Russians are able to listen in to Ukrainian communications because they have decrypted many of these communications, and that may explain why Ukrainian officer units on the ground, rather than rely on communications through radio systems, radio sets, are now increasingly resorting to the use of runners, like happened, for example, in the First World War. And then it goes on to say most of the military's operations are not phased and are sequential. Fire and manoeuvre are planned separately from infantry units, and infantry units planned separately from supporting artillery. The mentality also carries over to adjacent unit coordination, which is either non-existent or rare and causes high rates of fratricide. In other words, Ukrainian soldiers kill each other by mistake because they're not coordinated properly. It says unit commanders are concerned about collaborators and thus are hesitant to pass on critical information that can be used against them to sister units. Now that is an extremely interesting admission indeed. Unit commanders have concerns about collaborators. So officers don't trust the soldiers. They suspect that some of the soldiers might be sympathetic to the Russians and might be passing on information to the Russians. That's the only explanation I can provide for that particular sentence. And then it goes on to say these issues are compounded by unreliable communications between units and with senior leadership, and I've already explained one of the reasons for the problems. The Russians might be listening in. And it says the Ukrainian armed forces have a hodgepodge of radios that are vulnerable to jamming. And it says armed forces do not combine effects, so operations are piecemeal and disjointed. I have noticed this and have been talking about it ever since the Kherson counteroffensive, noticing that Ukrainian attacks are carried out in penny packet forms. Small groups of Ukrainian soldiers attacking against Russian positions. Sometimes when Russian positions themselves are lightly defended, as was the case in the Kharkiv region, and to a lesser extent in Kherson region, that does allow Ukrainian forces to sort of break through, but mostly it causes very heavy casualties. And it says the separate missions are not supporting each other, nor are the missions of lower level units nested under the higher level mission. Sustainment is not synchronized with operations either. And then it says that the variety of equipment now Ukraine now uses, that's just Western equipment, has led to significant logistics and maintenance challenges. In our experience, the Ukrainian military cannibalizes new equipment arriving in Ukraine to service equipment deployed in the field. As a result, frontline units only receive a small percentage of what is sent to the country. For example, a 50 caliber machine gun arrives in Ukraine with extra barrels, parts, manuals and accessories. But by the time it gets to Donbass, all that remains is the gun. Again, this article doesn't talk about corruption, but this is known to be a problem in Ukraine. And of course, we've had multiple reports now about the sale of weapon systems supplied to Ukraine via the dark net web. And in fact, there's been pictures of Mexican drug gangsters walking around with American equipment, which was apparently intended to be supplied to Ukraine. And then which was supplied to Ukraine, but which is obviously been sold on. And then we go on to read, Ukrainian forces have leaned on YouTube videos to learn how to use new and unfamiliar equipment. And the mentality of supply distribution in Ukraine is to husband resources, and there is not a steady state. Maintenance is based on cannibalization, horse trading between units, and battlefield recovery. There is not a steady stream of repair, parts, or a system of maintenance at the unit, battalion, brigade, and depot level. The skill of maintainers is based more on personal aptitude and less on school-trained mechanics. All the services have maintenance courses, but that does not translate into a ready pool of mechanics. And then it says that this attitude towards maintenance translates into how armour, mechanized vehicles, and artillery are used. In combat, units protect these assets and use tanks more as artillery than in combined arms operations with infantry. Mechanized vehicles will transport soldiers to the front, but many will pull back when they come under fire. We have also seen the barrels of the 155mm howitzers provided by Western countries shot out due to being used at maximum range, using maximum powder charges to keep them out of range of counter-battery fires. With the upcoming Ukrainian counteroffensive, effective use of these assets will be a key to success, and during offensive operations, the attacker usually loses more tanks, vehicles, and artillery than the defender. Notice this article, by the way, is written on the 2nd of June. So where is the time to achieve this enormous revolution? And it then goes on to say lack of coordinated maintenance and logistics also translates into medical care. Medical evacuation and care is haphazard. Experienced combat medics have repeatedly stated that many of the evacuees would have survived if they had reached definitive care in timely manner. And then there's a long piece about how Ukraine plugs the holes by using special forces and as conventional infantry. And this negates the skills that make these units specialized. Due to the high-intensity combat operations and the ongoing Russian counteroffensive, special operations force-type missions units are often put in the trenches and not assigned traditional special Operation Force type missions of raids, reconnaissance, and ambushes. Well, a lot of this, I have to say, is completely unsurprising, and it is the product of the steady attrition that the Ukrainian military has experienced. They've lost many of their best trained men. I've discussed how they lost many of their junior officers, many of their non-commissioned officers, and they're having to make do and patch things together. There's problems with corruption, the problem of this hodgepodge of weapons that they're getting from the West has been discussed by many people, myself included, that this is all a logistical nightmare. It is unsurprising that under the pressure of war, a degrading and depleting army is gradually running into the kind of problems that are being described here. And of course, if you add to all of that the fact that weapon systems are being lost, it's unsurprising that Ukraine is husbanding what it has left. So it's all very well saying, that the Ukrainians aren't using their tanks aggressively, that they're keeping their artillery back in the rear and firing it at maximum range. But if you are worried that if you bring your forces too close to the front line, your tanks and artillery will be destroyed, if you are worried also that you lack ammunition, if you feel that if you lose your tanks and artillery, your chances of getting replacements is limited, of course it is understandable that you are going to husband your resources. And I'm going to suggest that this emphasis on this counteroffensive that we've been hearing so much about for months is probably aggravating all of these problems. We have 12 brigades that are supposed to be equipped and trained to carry out this counteroffensive. And it is these 12 brigades that are getting all the new equipment, the Bradleys, the Strikers, the guns, the tanks, the Leopard 2s, the Challenger 2s, whereas the rest of the army is having to make do with what it has. And in the meantime, those 12 brigades, 30 to 40,000 men in total, are being kept far in the rear, and they're doing nothing. And not only are they doing nothing important on the battlefields, but on the contrary, far away as they are to the rear, they're being struck by Russian missiles, by Russian drones. They're seeing their ammunition also depleted because, of course, this offensive is always postponed because the equipment to conduct it is never there. So I don't think that this can all be blamed to some sort of residual Soviet mentality. As I said, this is always, as I said, the kind of thing that Westerners come up with. The Royal United Services Institute has provided a whole series of detailed studies about the condition of the Russian military. And I'm not going to spend time on that because we're talking about dozens of pages of analysis. But even as the Ukrainian army is degrading, many of these issues that the Ukrainians are suffering from have been resolved or are in the process of being resolved in the Russian military. Their communications are improving, their coordination with their artillery is getting better. They have these Strelets systems, consoles, which enable soldiers on the front lines to communicate directly with fire units. They're improving their reconnaissance. They're using their tanks in a completely different way from the way that the Ukrainians are using their tanks. There's been much discussion about the T-62s and T-55s that the Russians have been deploying to the battlefronts. In fact, it's become clear that to the extent that the Russians do use these old tanks, they are using them not as tanks, but as self-propelled guns to support the infantry. The really modern tanks, the T-90Ms and the more advanced versions of the T-72 and the refurbished T-80s, are being held back for operation in combined arms combat. And this article I've just read, for example, spoke about the fact that Ukrainians don't really use their tanks to support their troops in urban warfare, both in the fighting in Mariupol and in Bakhmut. The Russians did use their tanks to support their infantry assaults within the cities, and in fact they increasingly did so as the battle for Bakhmut evolved. And as previously discussed, how the tanks that were deployed in Bakhmut were T-90Ms, and they were apparently operated by Russian Marine units, naval infantry units. So there we go. That is the state of the Ukrainian army. It seems to me that this constant harping on this counteroffensive means that Ukraine now has in effect two armies. One is the bulk of the Ukrainian army, whose condition has been described here: degrading, running down, short of competent leadership at tactical level, short of equipment, improvising constantly, suffering horrendous losses on the battlefields, discussed in the various articles that I've discussed previously. And the other is this elite force of 12 brigades held back in the rear for an offensive that never comes, and which in the meantime is experiencing the loss of its precious supplies as a result of missile strikes and shelling and all the rest. Meanwhile, the spectre of corruption hangs over the whole thing, with, as these two writers are pointing out, the fact that the equipment, when it arrives in Ukraine, might be in one form. By the time it reaches the front line, it is in a completely different form. Most of the accessories and components and other parts have gone. They put it down to cannibalization, which perhaps is true. Corruption, I'm sure, plays a significant role as well. So, here we have it. These are American observers writing a report about the state of the Ukrainian army, the bulk of the Ukrainian army now. I have to say, reading all of this, it makes me feel deeply depressed. And of course, it also, I would have thought, should make Western leaders think very hard about what they're doing in Ukraine. They are pushing Ukraine into an offensive which will not only lose Ukraine, the best part of its military, but in fact probably the only part of its military that still works. The only part that's getting training, the only part that's getting some modern weapons. And of course, that military also has its problems. It's made up of units trained in different countries to different levels, no shared doctrine. It has to make do with a hodgepodge of different equipment from different countries. Doesn't always work together. There are differences in ammunition used by different Leopard 2 tanks, for example. The Leopard 2s used completely different ammunition from the Challenger 2s. The 105mm guns on the AMX-10 RC wheeled tanks, as they're called, that the French have supplied, is completely different from the 105mm guns used by the Leopard 1s that the Germans are going to try and supply. All of this really is an army hurriedly cobbled together, and which is gradually, incrementally coming apart. Now, it's understandable in the circumstances why the Ukrainians might be unwilling to conduct an offensive. And I think that we can get distracted by this endless dance about Ukraine wanting more and more weapons, more and more machines, more and more ammunition, and miss the actual picture, which is of an army that has been attritioned, if not yet fully to the point of collapse, at least to a point when a collapse is starting to look inevitable. Now, I've discussed why Western leaders want this offensive to happen. They may be hoping that if this offensive happens and fails, that would at last get the Ukrainians to accept the need for talks with the Russians, and there's some hope perhaps that something could be retrieved from all of this through those talks. It's also the case that this offensive, as I've said in my video yesterday, provides the glue that keeps this Western coalition together. They're all talking about supporting this offensive. They're all making their own contributions. There's hope that this offensive might succeed. If it doesn't, it doesn't. There it is. All I will say is, all of this is these are not good reasons to conduct an offensive. It's not good reasons to continue this war. It is based on a refusal to recognize the realities on the ground, which we have just had described to us by some Americans who are clearly soldiers. Is it not the time to put all this to one side, to finally accept those realities, to open talks with the Russians now? It is impossible to see how this offensive can fundamentally change the picture of the war. It can only make Ukraine's already critically bad situation far worse. Why not instead acknowledge that fact now? Talk to the Russians today and see whether perhaps the Russians, possibly working through Chinese mediation, might be more amenable to some kind of compromise than they're likely to be in the autumn. Well, there we go. That's my programme for today. There'll be much more from me soon. We'll see what happens over the next few weeks and whether this offensive does indeed come. But in the meantime, just to remind you, you can find all our programmes on our various channels: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can also go to our shop and buy our amazing things there, our mugs, our t-shirts, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel.